My ex-mother-in-law ruined my marriage, but now her new daughter-in-law has kicked her out of her home and wants my help. I've waited a long time to tell her that she can sleep on the street. I'm not sure if this would be approved by the moderators, as it's not the kind of thing that would fit into an Am I the Ass forum. I just want to share the experience I had with my ex-mother-in-law and how things turned out for me. It all started over a decade ago. I was married to a man for 3 years. Let's call him Dan. I was 23 at the time and he was 25. We had been dating for 2.5 years when I unexpectedly got pregnant. We were both scared, but we were in love, so we decided to take the plunge and get married. Looking back, I can see how rushed and precarious the decision was, but at the time, we were young and optimistic. It was actually Dan's idea for us to get married, since his mother was a religious woman and wouldn't like to have a grandchild out of wedlock. I wanted to have the baby, whether married or not, so when he proposed, it seemed like a perfect plan. We decided to marry a week after learning about the pregnancy because, to cover it up before it showed. I was a mess. Everything was happening so quickly, breaking the news to our parents, planning the wedding and medical appointments. Until then, I had never met his mother, Jane. Dan had mentioned her a few times during our relationship, but she lived several states away, and circumstances never aligned for us to meet. Knowing her religious leanings, I was worried about her reaction to our situation. However, Dan insisted that she would accept me, but I had my doubts. When I finally met her the day before our wedding, I knew instantly that things wouldn't be as smooth as Dan had assured me. The moment she walked through the door, I felt a wave of negativity spread through the house. You know that feeling when the wrong person approaches you? Her disapproval radiated from her like a bad smell. At first, I assumed it was because of the circumstances, her son marrying a woman he had impregnated. I understood that, in her eyes, the situation wasn't ideal. After all, she claimed to be a devoutly religious woman, someone who believed in doing things the right way. Dan was her only child. Her husband had died when he was 11, and since then she had been a single mother to Dan. She never remarried because she wanted to give Dan all her love and attention. Quite exemplary, right? I thought so too. However, I gradually realized that it was toxic. Anything in excess is harmful, and love is no exception. On the wedding day, her face was gloomy. Even my parents weren't thrilled with the situation, but they were happy I was starting a new chapter in my life. But Jane, oh my God, barely spoke to me. She just nodded curtly and gave me disapproving looks. When she did speak, it was to Dan, and her voice was laden with irritation. I heard snippets of their conversations. Most of it was her complaining about how messy everything was and how concerned she was about the consequences of such a rushed marriage. What should have been a joyful day turned into a stressful one. I was constantly tense, trying to ignore passive-aggressive comments and Jane's cold stares. Dan noticed my discomfort but downplayed it. He assured me that Jane would change her mind once she got to know me better, but she never did. After the wedding, she became a regular presence in our lives and our home. At first, it didn't feel too intrusive, and I thought she genuinely wanted to help us. She helped us set up the house, the baby's room, and so on. According to Dan, her father hadn't left her much financially, so she relied heavily on Dan for her support. This reliance wasn't just financial, it was emotional too. Dan was her only child, and she clung to him as if he were her lifeline. I tried to empathize, but I soon realized that Jane wasn't just a single mother needing support. She was a controlling woman who didn't know how to let go. She was loud and intrusive. She had an opinion on everything, from how we decorated our house to how we spent our weekends. Nothing was beyond her reach for criticism. If we bought something new for the house, she questioned why we needed it. If we went out to dinner, she commented on how we were wasting money. Every decision we made was scrutinized and judged by Jane. It was simply unbearable, but the worst part was how she treated my daughter. From the moment she was born, Jane was distant. She barely showed any affection towards her, which baffled me. I assumed she would be thrilled to have a granddaughter, but instead, she seemed almost resentful. I felt she blamed my daughter for our rushed marriage. She couldn't stand that Dan paid attention to me or our daughter. She wanted Dan's attention all to herself. I was too young and naive to confront her. Everything was bad with her. We had just started our careers, and our salaries weren't great, just enough to make ends meet. Moreover, Dan had the responsibility of his mother. We couldn't afford a nanny, so Dan used to ask Jane to watch our daughter. She wasn't happy about it, but how could she say no to her big baby? So, for a while, she moved in with us. However, most of the time, I would come home and find my baby crying, while Jane sat quietly knitting in the living room. When I asked her why she had left the baby crying without doing anything, she said the baby needed to toughen up, and that she was trying to teach her how to self-soothe. Once my baby had vomited and was rolling around in her own vomit, God knows for how long, and that woman didn't even bother to check why she was crying. Since then, I stopped having her around to take care of my baby, as she constantly criticized the way I was raising her. We had to get a nanny, which luckily we could afford by then. I used to tell Dan that she was spoiling the baby too much. She hated me and my baby. She never said anything openly, but her actions spoke for themselves. The most painful part was when I overheard her talking on the phone with someone. I love Dan, but that girl, she's too much like her mother. She's going to cause problems. I confronted Dan about this, and he said that maybe I had heard out of context, and that I should have known the full context before drawing conclusions. A year passed, and by the time my daughter turned 1, my resentment toward Jane had reached its peak. I felt like I was constantly walking on eggshells in my own home, not to mention the postpartum anxiety, setbacks in my career, and a long list of other issues. Dan, unfortunately, wasn't helping at all. He was stuck in the middle and refused to take sides. Every time I mentioned the problem, he would tell me I was exaggerating or that I needed to be more patient with his mother. Worse still, he attributed it to my postpartum anxiety. He said he had many other things to worry about and didn't want to get involved in this catfight. Yes, those were his words. He didn't understand the impact this was having on me and our marriage. The final straw came when my daughter was just over a year old. We were at Jane's house celebrating her birthday, and as usual, she was in a bad mood. She spent the whole afternoon criticizing everything we did for her, the cake we bought, the gifts we gave, and so on. But the breaking point came when my daughter accidentally spilled a glass of juice. As she drank the juice, she playfully spilled it. It was a simple mischief that all babies do at that age, but Jane's reaction was anything but simple. She yelled at my daughter, calling her clumsy and careless. My baby started crying. Dan was there, but Jane wouldn't let him intervene. That witch was worried about staining the carpet, and that son of a witch just stood there, letting my baby cry. I was on the other side of the hallway, and as soon as I heard the chaos, ran to pick her up and comfort her. Jane looked at Danny and said, "See, this is what I'm talking about. She doesn't discipline the child and doesn't let others do it. I bet this child is going to cause you a lot of problems as she grows up." I remember standing up, trembling with rage, and telling Jane that she had no right to yell at my daughter. I told her that if she couldn't treat my daughter with the love and respect she deserved, then she had no place in our lives. Dan, instead of supporting me, tried to downplay the situation, telling me to calm down and that Jane hadn't meant what she said. But I had reached my limit, and told him I was fed up with dealing with a man without character, who still hadn't gotten over the stage of being in his mother's lap. The witch and the witch's son were offended by my words, but that didn't stop me from leaving, not only from her house but from our marriage as well. I went home and started packing my things. Dan came in angrily, wanting to continue the argument, but when he saw me packing, he lost his temper. I don't know why he was surprised. What did he expect me to do? Stay there and keep putting up with the toxic duo of mother and son? He said I shouldn't make impulsive decisions because our daughter's well-being was at stake. I yelled at him, asking why he was concerned about our daughter now, but wasn't when his mother scolded her over something trivial. Now he was crying, sobbing because I was supposedly separating him from his daughter. He started apologizing and said he would set boundaries with his mother, but I told him I no longer wanted boundaries. I wanted him to choose. Either Jane left our lives or we did. I couldn't allow my daughter to grow up in an environment where her own grandmother constantly belittled her. Dan, as expected, tried to stay neutral. "I don't understand this man. He's not a country. He's not Switzerland. He's a man who can't take sides on anything. He said he loved us both and couldn't choose between his mother and his wife, but I had already made my decision." I left that very night, leaving him crying. The divorce was quick, and to be honest, it was a relief. I felt like I had lifted a weight off my shoulders. Dan and I had grown apart after our marriage, and Jane had created a rift between us that couldn't be repaired. I took my daughter and moved to a smaller house on the other side of town. Dan paid child support, but I had to work extra hours to support us both. It wasn't easy to start over, but it was necessary. Jane, of course, moved in with Dan after the divorce to take care of him. The big baby needed mommy's care. She was looking forward to holding her son in her arms, and the divorce gave her a great opportunity to do so. I didn't care at all. I moved on with my life. The first few months were tough. I missed the good times I had with Dan, but the bitterness that plagued our marriage pushed me to move on faster. I obtained full custody of my daughter, and Dan had 2 hours of supervised visitation each week. After she turned 3, Dan had 1 day a week. I had to face Dan for the sake of my daughter, but it was only a formal greeting. I set clear rules that Jane would not be near my daughter, and fortunately, Dan respected that. He never tried to force a relationship between Jane and our daughter. In any case, Jane wasn't interested. It has been 7 years since our divorce. My daughter is a little over 8 years old now. I've been dating someone for 2 years, and it's been great, knock on wood. My daughter has grown very fond of him. Dan, however, had been single until now. In fact, he was quite surprised when he found out about my boyfriend. He asked me how I could have moved on so quickly. It took me 5 years to move on, but for him, it was too fast. Anyway, I don't know what happened to him after that. He started living alone and asked his mother to move in with him. Recently, he started dating again, and last month he got married. I didn't know much about his new wife, except for the occasional details my daughter shared after visiting her dad. From what I heard, she is kind and affectionate, and my daughter seems to like her, which is all that really matters to me. Some time ago, my daughter told me that during her last visit, Jane showed up and wanted to hug her. But Dan's wife did not allow Jane to come near her. She also turned her back on Jane and said, "Jane, I would appreciate it if you called us before showing up unannounced. If there is something urgent, you can meet Dan at his office." Jane left immediately. I wonder if the same cycle will repeat, and if Dan will be facing another divorce. I hope this time he learns his lesson and knows to let his mother go. His daughter might also resent him for his toxic attachment to his mother. But unfortunately, he doesn't see it that way. Update 1. I didn't expect so many people to read and comment on this. Thank you all. I don't have much to update, but as many requested, here we go. During the first few months of their marriage, things seemed to be going well for Dan and his wife. Even my daughter enjoyed her time with them. They even went on vacation together. I was a bit nervous about letting her go, but his wife assured me she would take care of her, so I relaxed a bit. It's not like I have a very close relationship with Dan's new wife, but I've seen her a few times when I went to pick up my daughter. She told me about Jane's interference. Apparently, Jane moved in with Dan some time ago because she's sick and cannot live alone. I wasn't surprised. Jane had always depended on Dan, and I knew she wouldn't tolerate seeing her son happy with his wife. It's only been a few months, and their marriage is already starting to deteriorate. My daughter told me that since the grandmother moved in, Dan and his wife have been arguing about everything. From how the house is managed to how Dan's money is spent, the atmosphere in the house has become tense. His wife opposed the situation, but Dan asked her to endure his mother for a while, until he found a permanent solution. Before getting married, when he asked Jane to move in, he hoped he had finally realized the toxic love of Jane and was getting out of it. But no, I was wrong. He is still a mama's boy who refuses to leave his mother's lap. He ruined our marriage because of his mother and is now willing to risk his second marriage too. God, there are some people who never learn from their mistakes. Everything that happened in my marriage is happening again, only this time, Dan's wife is the one dealing with Jane's toxic behavior. I feel some sympathy for her, knowing well the hell she is going through, but it also gave me a sense of validation. It wasn't just me. Jane was the problem. In the past 2 weeks, my daughter has refused to visit Dan. When he asked her why, she clearly told him she didn't want to go because they were always fighting and arguing, and she didn't like her grandmother. Dan promised to take her out on their next visit and not meet at his house. I hope Dan learns his lesson soon and acts quickly if he doesn't want to face a second divorce. His daughter might also resent him for his toxic attachment to his mother, but unfortunately he doesn't see it that way. Update 2. Sorry for not updating earlier, there wasn't much to report, but this is interesting. Yesterday, I received an unexpected visit, my ex-mother-in-law. As I mentioned in the last post, Jane moved in with Dan, claiming she was sick and couldn't live alone. This obviously affected their marriage, and things got worse. But fortunately, Dan resolved it just in time. After 4 months, Dan finally realized that his mother was the problem and asked her to leave. However, she kept delaying, asking for some time to organize her things until Dan's wife got fed up and kicked her out of the house. One day, Jane went out to meet her friends and upon returning, found her belongings outside. She knocked on the door, but Dan's wife didn't open and shouted for her to leave. Jane called Dan and told him what happened, but he said he had to support his wife this time. Well, I'm glad he finally came to his senses. This was one thing, but what happened next surprised me even more. Jane wasn't just kicked out of the house, but she was also cut off financially and left to her own devices. As a single mother and Dan's only child, she had no one else to turn to. She also wasn't on good terms with any of her family members. I never met any of Dan's relatives while I was married to him. I received the news with some skepticism. That is, it's not like Dan wouldn't take her back. But anyway, yesterday she showed up. I hadn't seen or heard anything from Jane since the divorce, so you can imagine my surprise when she appeared at my door. It was snowing heavily outside. I was alone at home since my daughter was at a friend's house for a play date. Jane was there, looking like a soaked rat. For a moment I was speechless. I never expected to see her again, let alone at my door. But as soon as the shock passed, I was filled with anger. I thought, how dare she come here to my house after everything she put me through? Before I could say anything, she started crying desperately. She told me how Dan and his wife had kicked her out and that she had nowhere to go. Yes, she has a house, but it's deteriorating without proper maintenance. She begged me, saying she had no one else to turn to and that she was sorry for everything that had happened between us. But her apology meant nothing to me. I could see right through it. She wasn't lamenting what she had done, she was lamenting the situation she was in now. She wasn't here because she had changed or genuinely wanted to make amends. She was here because she had run out of options. She wanted money to pay her bills and couldn't survive solely on her pension. I felt nothing but disdain. This was the woman who had ruined my marriage, who had made my life hell for years, who had treated my daughter as if she were unwanted, and now she had the nerve to ask me for help. I didn't shout or get angry, but I didn't even let her into my house. I simply looked her in the eye and asked her to leave. She started pleading, saying I was her last hope and all that. I told her she should get a job instead of dumping her problems on others. She stood there for a moment, looking at me with disbelief at my language. Before she could say anything else, I told her she could sleep on the street like the rat she was and slammed the door in her face. I didn't feel anything after that. Since that day, Jane has tried to contact me several more times. She called, left messages, and even sent a letter apologizing and saying it was karma coming back to her. But I ignored all of it and blocked her. I owe her no response. Later, I learned from Dan's wife that Jane has finally moved into a small apartment in a senior community. From what I understand, Dan has finally started to see his mother for what she really is. As for me, I've long moved past this. I'm focused on raising my daughter and building a happy and stable life for us. As I mentioned, I've started dating again, and while I'm not rushing into anything, I have hopes for the future. Life really has many twists, doesn't it? Update 3. I didn't expect to make another update, but after what happened, I felt I had to share it. Yesterday, I spoke with Dan's new wife, and the conversation was more revealing than I anticipated. I met her when I went to pick up my daughter. She was waiting for me outside, and after the usual pleasantries, she asked me to stay for a while to talk. As I mentioned before, I'm not particularly close to her, but I've come to see her as a good person who genuinely cares about my daughter, which will always be the most important thing for me. We sat in the living room, and almost immediately, she thanked me for something I didn't expect. She told me she was grateful for setting boundaries with Jane and that, although we didn't know each other well, she felt I understood Jane better than anyone. Then she started to tell me everything that had happened while Jane was living with them. It turns out that Jane was even worse with her than she had been with me. From the moment she moved in, she began to criticize absolutely everything. How Dan's new wife kept the house, how she cooked, even how she dressed. Jane even tried to impose her own rules in the house, changing the decor and organizing everything according to her taste. It was as if she wanted it to be her house and not theirs. I immediately understood how frustrating that must have been for her. The new wife also told me how Jane tried to sabotage their marriage from within. Apparently, Jane told Dan that his wife wasn't good enough for him, that she didn't know how to run a household, and that he deserved better. It pained me to hear this, because it felt like reliving what had happened to me. Jane also tried to interfere in every decision they made together, from the small to the large. I couldn't believe that after so many years, Jane hadn't changed at all. If anything, she had gotten worse. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Dan's new wife confessed that, for a while, she thought she would never be able to get Jane out of the house. She told me that if it hadn't been for Dan, Jane would probably still be there. According to her, there was a moment when she realized their marriage was in real danger. She told Dan that she couldn't continue living that way, and that if Jane didn't leave, she would have to go. To my surprise, she said that Dan was the one who finally decided to kick Jane out of the house. Dan, the man who had never dared to confront his mother during our marriage, had finally done the right thing. According to his wife, it was a difficult decision for him, but he realized he had to choose between his marriage and his mother. When Jane refused to leave, Dan supported his wife and helped her remove Jane's belongings from the house. This surprised me because I never thought Dan could do something like that. But I was glad to hear that, for once in his life, he had done the right thing. It also gave me a sense of closure to know that Dan had finally set limits with his mother. It was something he never did when we were married, and although it doesn't change the past, it gave me some peace to know he had finally learned his lesson. What we had didn't work out, and maybe that was for the best, but at least Dan is now doing right by his wife. In the end, Dan's new wife thanked me because she believes that my divorce from Dan opened his eyes. I don't think I did much, but I also thanked her for being good to my daughter. I also told her that although our story was difficult, I was glad that she and Dan had a chance to be happy together. Then I left, and we agreed to meet another day for coffee. Update 4. Yesterday I met with Dan's new wife for coffee. We've been talking a bit more lately, and although our relationship started out as simply cordial for the sake of my daughter, I've come to see her as someone I can trust. We met at a small cafe near my house. As we talked about trivial things and caught up, she mentioned something that surprised me. They've had news about Jane. She told me that, apparently Jane is not doing well. She has become even more ill, and from what they've heard, it's largely due to her emotional state. Since being forced to move to the senior community apartment, she has fallen into a deep sadness. According to her, Jane hasn't been able to adapt to her new life and feels extremely lonely. This didn't surprise me too much, given that she always relied on Dan for everything, and never made an effort to maintain healthy relationships with others. What surprised me more was that Dan, despite everything, has visited her a few times. Dan's wife told me that he feels bad for her, and it's hard for him to see her in that state. However, she said that Dan, although he feels compassion for Jane, has made it clear that he doesn't intend to bring her back into his life. Dan knows what she's like now. She told me that, as much as it pains him to see her like this, he knows that if he lets her back into his life, everything will go back to how it was before. He doesn't want to risk his relationship or the stability they have built. Years ago, I would never have imagined sitting with Dan's wife talking about these things, especially about how everything ended for Jane. But I can't deny that I'm glad things turned out this way because everyone has been able to move on with their lives and everything seems to be going better.